All right, how's it going? How's it going? I had a fun time yesterday doing my um, stream where I was discussing the Passion of the Christ, and I didn't get the biggest audience in the world, but you know, I had a fun time doing it. Um, so I thought I'd strike again while the iron is hot, or not, and do another one. I don't have that much time today, so we'll have to see how much I can get through. I wanted to initially talk about this thing that they've been doing at the Shanghai Biennale and Eflux Journal about, it's called Cosmos Cinema. I got so much to say about this series that I thought maybe I'll put that on the back burner. Maybe if I get some time this weekend, I might do something on that. And I'll maybe today I'll do something a little bit more extemporaneous, um, improvised. Just talk about this book, which you see here on the screen, New Media in Art History, which was published last year. I picked it up a few months ago. It's a pretty interesting work that fits into a really interesting cultural juncture. Um, so to set the scene a little bit, you know, I think we have a lot of cultural anxieties and dissatisfactions today that I kind of personally think um, boil down to our media environment. There used to be this kind of idea that you'd hear from all kinds of different people, like, Orson Welles was a big advocate of medium um, relative. You know, when Orson Welles made Citizen Kane, he wanted to use the entire space, use the native language and the formal space of the film medium to fully accomplish the goals that he had for the feature, to do something that really used film in a native way. And uh, every medium has its own particular characteristics and has its own ways of being used. But now we find ourselves, and this is the story, with so many different aspects of the world, we find ourselves in this hyper accelerated digital media environment. It's not all digital, but the media environment is so much more imminent and expansive and surrounds so many more aspects of our lives. And we play into it more as both inputting into it and outputting into it. Like, the world is far more mediated than it ever has been. Um, and I think there's this is part of why so many people today have this deep dissatisfaction, is like uh, more fundamental than um, look, there are questions of material well-being and um, society and etc. that obviously impacts how people are feeling, but I think the cultural environment is really central to this question as well. Like, people feel unsatisfied with their media environment. I think it's not living up to um, the degree of immersion that we have in it. I think that the scale and integration and the formal space used by modern media is far less. It's far less um, sophisticated. It's playing very simple linear liminal games rather than, full immersive contact sports with your mind in the way that something like Citizen Kane was trying to do in its situation and its environment. And part of the story as to why that is, we've had all this media that's folded in on itself and it's become more dense and more complicated. So it's hard to keep up with that as, you know, some lone purveyor of things in the media environment. And there are, of course, market dynamics to this where, the information market online, the attention market, or whatever you want to call it, um, allocates, uh, you know, our allocates more resources is benefits the most simplistic, the lowest common denominator, the limbic capitalism, the informational limbic capitalism, trash exploitative products online. And you see this everywhere. You see this in, whatever's popular on TikTok or Twitter or whatever. Um, but another critical part of this story is this, we had this explosion of new media. Um, right, you can trace this back to different times, but I think, the mid 20th century, TV, video, um, you know, uh, new possibilities for um, other, computers are another one. New possibilities for older art forms like sculpture and exhibition and installation that integrate newer technologies. Um, and we had this huge explosion that was sort of founded off some of these media theorists like McLuhan and Aurelio, and you can point to Fluxus and all this kind of stuff. And this explosion happened, and in our thinking, we didn't really catch up to the level of expansiveness and the new depths and new spaces and new ways of creating and seeing and interacting with aesthetics and really um, making and remaking and unmaking our reality that this revolution really entailed. Our critical consensus, our 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 discursive culture didn't really comprehend it. It didn't really keep up with these transformations. It didn't really do it justice. It didn't really chart that course. So we've had this rapid transformation that's only accelerated over the years. Everyone's, swimming in these new aesthetic worlds and media spaces constantly, but the media that we have in these spaces increasingly um, fractured, um, small. Um, I think there's a desire for some things to be sewn together, something bigger wholes to be created in this space, and I think that is part of the um, background as to at least why I think this book is necessary, and likely part of the background as to why this was put together. So this was done by some, I think it's, yeah, in the Swiss Association of Art Historians. They put up they did this conference, Art History and New Media. What's up? That's what it's called. What's up? um, at the House of Electronic Arts. Um, and this book is kind of a um, uh, compilation of essays that kind of were spun out of this conference and this um, discussion. And this is and they're each charting different methods of it approaching the topic of art history as pertains doing this kind of historical work of understanding um, and charting through and applying concepts from art theory to new media, um, as far back as video art and the what will be called cathodic art, um, in the 60s and 70s, um, to as recently as live streaming on twitch.tv and stuff like that. So this is a really expansive book, even though it's quite short. I mean, I think it's like 130 pages, and they're not huge pages, and there are a lot of pictures, but it's several essays that are quite wide-ranging about this subject of new media, um, directions in new media that haven't maybe been explored in explored discursively to the fullest extent. Um, and yeah, and it really works by having all these different perspectives and directions collated into this single, quite concise volume. It does a really neat job of putting together this range of possibilities and um, inspiring thought about directions in art and art history. So yeah, that's kind of a brief overview of what it's like. There's 8 essays in here. The first one is this discussion of Vera Molnar, and I should say it's divided into 3 sections: history and historiography of media. Sorry. The first one is called, the first one in this first section is called Screenshots from the 1970s, Vera Molnar's Experiments in Interactive Computing. And Vera Molnar, I've started to see her around a lot. She did this series of images, printouts of digital images in the 1970s, um, of squares deformed in different ways. And she's been kind of picked up as like a cyber feminist figure. Um, Recently, I've been seeing a lot of stuff about her, so I guess her stock is soaring. The second one is um, and I should say that one's by Zsófi Valianagi. So a Hungarian author writing about a Hungarian artist. The next one's Cathodic Art in France, from experimenting with the medium to experiencing the media. And this is kind of like a charting the history of what you might call video art in France from 1970 to 1990, and picking up different strands and things. And they call it the cathodic art, which I think is quite useful as distinct from video, because like obviously we have video art still to this day, and it's evolving and taking new shapes post the um, dawn of digital video as opposed to tape. So this distinction, insofar as like cathode ray tape oriented arts are really a thing of the past, which I think they kind of are. Um, I think it is a useful distinction to call it cathodic. They also use the term um, televisual, which I think maybe is a little less useful insofar as people would say that television is a live medium to this day. I mean, the characteristics of it, what you would call TV today versus TV in 1950 or whatever, when McLuhan was writing about it as a low informational medium or whatever. It's like apples and oranges. So I think the word televisual is just not a useful one. Um, anyway, that's by Fleur Chevalier. Okay, I shouldn't say the names because I'm terrible at this. Maybe I'll just my condolences for that. But the third one is live on Twitch, the art history and classification for of performances in digital games. And this is kind of like extending some of these critical concepts about performance art to this realm of live streaming as an art form in its own right. Um, and that's the last one in the first section. So the next section is called Use and Reception of New Media, with the fourth essay, Digital Art and the Quantification of Aesthetic Perception. And this one is kind of, I think I'll talk a little bit more about this one in a bit, but this one is really tracing these two lines of like unpacking or uh, breaking down the images within the digital space to understand them on a um, formal level of their components, um, like the visual elements of an image innately in computational terms, versus the other direction, trying to understand how humans innately interact with images, visually, you know, tracing our eye movements to understand this relationship. Um, then we have Software Garden, Life in Digital Matter, which is kind of like a um, field report on pandemic era new media in action, told from this kind of very personal, um, individuated perspective. Um, and then the third section is creation, conservation, mediation, um, and the first essay. The third section I found a little bit less interesting, but the sixth essay overall there is translation of the art and architecture thesaurus in Switzerland, vision and implementation. And the seventh, the Retour or Sources research project, how to think and practice digital creation in French art schools. And finally, the eighth essay is new media for the visualization of architecture. Maybe I didn't need to list off all those, but maybe it's worth having them out there somewhere. So, a few things. I think this does really succeed. I was saying this a little bit before. It does really succeed in creating something that's more than the sum of its parts by having all these kind of complementary but divergent directions. So you can maybe think of the way that some of these things interplay, or um, think about the space within the angle between the two vectors of any two particular essays. Um, and it really does do a good job of like charting the trajectory of art history into the present, um, uh, which really, as I was saying before, is like critical to answering that question that you kind of see in a lot of different spaces. Like there's a um, there's a video art piece from the collective Botborg, which is called "To Bypass a Sensory Roadblock," and I think that that's a really intensive video art piece, and I think that is talking about the same thing in a way that Jean-Luc Godard is talking about with Goodbye to Language. And people are talking about when they talk about how, um, you know, digital and internet critical people are talking about when they say, oh, we're going back to media theory and we have to return to being human or whatever. Like they're all kind of talking about the same thing, the same curve, the same bulb in the trajectory of human beings in aesthetic spaces in our living environments. But anyway, so the third essay on performance, I think, was one of the ones I found it intriguing. Um, Let me try and recall. I found it intriguing as well as somewhat um, instructively wrong because it opens with this quote from Marina Abramovic where she says, to be a performance artist, you have to hate theater. Theater is fake. The knife is not real, the blood is not real, and the emotions are not real. Performance is just the opposite. The knife is real, the blood is real, and the emotions are real. And then the author goes on to kind of say that this is like some ironic contrast with the digital space of um, digitized performances, and like the essay kind of circles around this notion of um, real and virtuality um, as regards digital performances. But I think this quote is exactly wrong, and this kind of starting place is the exact opposite of where you should start, because the very um, existence, the very notion of digital performance art, and that it's already established somewhat. I mean, you can talk about people who do this in different places. I saw some short film. I forget. I mean, you could call it a film or not. There was sort of like a quasi pornographic performance. Um, so yeah, I think digital performance art is very much real. It's very much legitimate. And what it proves is that this quote is totally wrong, and that it's really the first order experiential dimension that people who are viewing and interacting with the art feel that that is critical, rather than this kind of conceptually rigid idea of authenticity, or you know what's real and what's fake, because at the end of the day, that's like a kind of that's a very um, it's a very rigid and um, object-oriented way of thinking, right? It's like something is fake. And I think this is something that pops up in a lot of art theory and a lot of critique these days, is this kind of object-based thinking as opposed to system thinking. Like, for example, there's a quote in one of the later pieces where I think it's the fourth piece, which is the one about digital art and the quantification of perception, where they say, let me see, I have it here. It's easy to imagine areas in which digital methods would fail to account for the complexity of their subject. And this is sort of um, put as opposed to analog. And I think it's this kind of object-based thinking where you're thinking about digital not in systemic terms, but as an object, like uh, essentially similar to like an analog medium, just directionally different. Um, and they don't have this fluid notion of these concepts. And I think it's the same with this idea of um, authenticity and the real. Like it's a static defined element in the makeup and conception of this essay about live on Twitch, about digital performance art through mediated through video games or just through a webcam or whatever. Like it's anyway, I think to sort of put a bow on that, like I think theoretical understanding should be pliable to the realities, the aesthetic realities, the felt realities of the present, and not the inverse. Like the theory has to bend, not the reality, because that's just a way to end up nowhere again, to tie yourself into a loop and totally fail at the task at hand. But okay, I said I would talk a little bit about the fourth essay, and I think this was the most interesting by far in the book. So, like I said before, this is about tracing these two different lines of inquiry. One, this attempt to quantify images through computation, um, to analyze and break down digital images in in computers to understand their elements in a purely like dehumanized sort of formal level, um, which unfortunately they don't spend as much time on. And the other direction that the other direction of attack, the other line, the other converging line is studying human perception and visible signs of human perception and how we interact with images. Now, I think this is so critical because with the convergence of these two lines of inquiry, we can totally make and unmake reality. Like this kind of computational um, process is like this this computational process meeting with um, this if we can unite these two sides of perception, like this is like the neuroscience psychology divide, but we don't have to see the inside of the human mind to even solve the problem. Although this is something that the author somewhat might disagree with me on, because they kind of say that um, they kind of make this is or type distinction between the what and the why of aesthetic appreciation. But I don't really think we need to know the inner mind. Like I was saying, like I think the why is always just going to be a subjective thing. If if the emergence of things like limbic capitalism and the information ecosystem, that the predatory, maybe that's a bit too strong language, but the information ecosystem that we have online now, if that shows anything, is that, you know, the why is almost irrelevant in terms of constructing these kinds of aesthetic worlds that can dominate someone's reality. The why, the internal narrative, is not something. It doesn't need to be addressed. It doesn't need to be answered in quite so strong terms. Anyway, they also kind of have this. They also kind of have this. With the first line of inquiry, they kind of uh, assume that there are some pieces missing, right? This kind of um, uh, computational deconstruction of the image is inherent to the development of digital images itself. Like, uh, for example, like there's a really good book by this guy, Alvy Ray Smith, who was the founder of Pixar, um, called The Biography of the Pixel. And it talks about the development of the concept of pixels and visual sampling, and how this was used to generate digital images, like how this was used as a theoretical foundation for the creation of digital images themselves at the time when, this is in the early days of computation as well. Like the very concept of the pixel is a concept of a picture element, like a sample. It's like a sample that you use to combine with other samples to generate, via extrapolation, a whole image. So you can kind of, it's about scaling, it's about compression, it's about resolving, right? So the entire concept of digital images itself presupposes the kind of deconstruction that, you know, is stretched for here in this article. I don't feel like he fully got there. And with Fourier analysis, you can hypothetically totally deconstruct the image, define or describe a formal range, like a range of aesthetic visual potentialities within a single image, or a set of images at any resolution, right? Like mathematically, you can define a formal range. Um, and this is kind of like, this is a partial component of digital image systems already. Like when you turn on your screen and you put on an MKV file, Matroska video file, like that has an encoding that is um, a very indirect proxy for the kind of system that I'm talking about. Um, we don't really need, in the essay, um, the author invokes like large language models and AI systems kind of a little bit inelegantly to prove that the quantification of art and aesthetic experience is possible in this computational space. But the mere fact that these spaces exist as aesthetic channels in the first instance is proof enough of that concept, right? Like that you can um, express yourself aesthetically through these um, digital spaces that boil down to some approximation, that boil down to some binary code or assembly language or Matroska video encoding or whatever, is proof enough of the quantifiability of at least the um, at least the direct substance of a work dimension of aesthetic experience and perception. Um, but anyway, as to this convergence uh, of these two lines of inquiry about the computational and the um, human perception focused one, like we will never complete this convergence if we just remain in the realm of single flat static images. We need interactivity, which, to be fair, he talks about a little bit, he or she, I'm not quite sure. Um, interactivity, improved latency, um, VR, multiple image fields. Like there's a whole range of ways that this could be studied at a more intensive, less intensive level. Like you need to explore the full range of images and how we react to them in a broad and comprehensive way, um, to really complete or get the hooks in on the human end of this dynamic. Um, and like as we enter this kind of deep totalizing digital submersion, we should expect digital media to interact with our minds like water flowing through a canyon, right? Like both conforming to its shape, the water conforming to the shape of the canyon, and the digital environment that we're submerged in conforming to our minds and eroding them and shaping them in turn, unearthing and flowing into heretofore undiscovered nooks and crannies. Like that's this is like the complete understanding of what they talk a little bit in this volume about post-digital. I don't think we have post-digital. If you want to call anything post-digital, I think that would be post-digital, or even you could really call it true digital. Um, the full arrival and emergence of digital is that full saturation where you have this interactive system where our minds expand, our cognitive environment is so thoroughly transformed that we accelerate um, mentally and sensorially and grow and expand into new ways of um, being and feeling that we could never comprehend beforehand. Um, and this is part of my conception of the, you know, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy has this concept of the polycinema, and I think that would be the true polycinema. Anyway, but yeah, like as we become increasingly unglued from an unmediated sensory equilibrium, you know, the pre-media, the sort of state of nature, if you will, we can expect to reach these strange new equilibria. Anyway, that's a somewhat deep tangent, but at the end of this essay, they kind of urge caution about pursuing this line of inquiry and the being deliberate about critique here. And I think this is totally wrong. And I think we have to reject this way of thinking about um, progress down this direction specifically. Aside from, people can talk about ethical issues of hyper um, cognitively invasive systems or whatever, but I think as regards, they talk a little bit about automation and this work called the digital genome, which is uh, a video work that kind of has this semiotic tree where it plays these videos and then appends them with labels that say, I noticed this is this, like there's a bench in the picture, and stuff like that. This a kind of crude unpacking of the um, visual elements in the field of an image, right? The objects and so on, and it implies human value judgment as well. But like as digital worlds fold in on themselves into generative frameworks like large language models and AI, they innately draw in the kind of textual subjective assessments described in the digital genome, right? The autocriticality of these kind of systems is already baked into the cake because it's just like that. They're people relative, digital um, um, digital generative systems. They're highly people relative, and the data that fuels them is people relative as well. So I think um, more broadly, I think we can we can have acceleration down this path, um, uh, at least of intellectual inquiry, somewhat unchecked, and it'll be productive and useful, um, insofar as any of this is useful. I said at the onset that I think um, socially and in terms of well-being, being able to make and unmake our reality is very useful. Um, yeah. Anyway, the next essay, Software Garden, I thought was also a little bit um, telling because it's like this field report from this personal, individuated perspective that also um, really seeks to bring in this kind of um, expansive social critique into the realm of um, new media performance, that I think is fine on Tumblr or whatever. And I don't mean to be dismissive with anything I say in this, but is not is not the juggling act is a bit precarious, basically. This in the first instance, this kind of individuated um, shift into the perspective of the individual and unique personal experiences as the driving motor behind art, as opposed to something more collective, is a part of what has got us to this place in the first place, where aesthetics and culture are failing us, or they're failing to um, accelerate to the degree that we need them to. Um, and I think on some level, with something like this, i i we need to extricate ourselves from a liberatory political paradigm and just let the experiment run, let the simulation run, um, and uh, see what is possible, right? And see what emerges. I think it's fair to draw in some of these things, but like to expect, the the theoreticians, they expect at once too much and too little of themselves. They want to, you know, um, bridge the personal to the universal, but not to um, really have this uh, concrete, forward-looking exploration of the possible. Um, and I get that I'm maybe putting a little bit too much on this one book, um, but you know, and then they expect too little and too much of the artist. They want the artist to. They don't expect the artist to be reality transforming, but merely to express their personal truth in an authentic form, and that's it. That's enough. It doesn't need to be reality transforming. It doesn't need to be expressing something new or something relative to our time and place. It just needs to be a personal expression, which only the artist can judge anyway. It's like it's truly solipsistic. But then they also expect it to have something to contribute to questions of existential risks and broad social problems and fixing climate change and stuff like that. And I think we need to chuck this paradigm out the window as involves both art history and, you know, what you might say is art history going forward. And look, I can concede that some of what I'm saying here definitely falls outside the scope or the intention of the initial project, and maybe that's a bit unfair to layer it on that. But and I don't want to sound too harsh either, because I did really enjoy this book, and I do think it had a lot of interesting stuff to say and some useful new directions and ways of thinking about these issues. And I don't want to come across as condescending or anything, because, like I said in the previous episode that I did yesterday, like, I have no special knowledge or qualifications or whatever. Um, but yeah, by linking up some of the vectors of attack explored in this book with each other and adopting a more direct aesthetic comprehension of new media and mediums, there can be real progress on creating an aesthetic environment for the modern day. Um, yeah, and I think that maybe covers it. Um, yeah, I am a little bit busy this evening. So I think I may have to call it there, but hopefully I said something useful. Hopefully that's at least something to think about or chew on. But yeah, hopefully I'll be able to have time to talk a little bit about Cosmos cinema this weekend. But I don't know. I was a little bit off the goop. I was a little bit tired today. So I apologize if that was a bit incomprehensible or a bit of a crazy rant. Maybe it was. I think perhaps it was, but hey, what can you do? What can you do? Sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you have a long day, all right? Cut me some slack. And on that basis, I'd like to say, cut me some slack if my criticisms didn't make sense. I was trying to say something real, okay? All right. Catch you later. Cheers.